to leave, but his expression said enough. He sized JD up, his jaw tightening ever so slightly before he spoke. "What's the issue here?" Don asked, his voice steady but firm. JD met his gaze, keeping his posture relaxed, but his words carried weight. "I was just told I can't be served tonight. I'd like to understand why." Don let out a slow breath through his nose, glancing at the hostess, then back at JD. "It's nothing personal," he said, but the way he said it made it clear that wasn't entirely true. JD studied him for a moment, then nodded once, as if accepting the explanation even though there hadn't really been one. "All right," he said simply. No anger, no argument, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. And then, just like that, he turned and walked toward the door. The diner remained silent, the tension thick in the air. Someone shifted in their seat. Another cleared their throat. But no one spoke up. As JD reached the door, he paused for just a second, taking in the place one last time. The faces, the atmosphere, the quiet weight of what had just happened. Then, without another word, he stepped outside, the bell above the door jingling behind him. The night air was cool against his skin as he exhaled, his breath visible in the glow of the neon sign. He could still smell the grilled burgers, still hear the low murmur of voices inside. But out here, under the open sky, there was only silence. JD took a deep breath, shook his head slightly, then climbed into his car. No outburst. No dramatic confrontation. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes things play out exactly the way people expect them to.
And tonight?
Tonight was one of those times. One who acts like he's one of us, but when it comes down to it, you're not. The words landed heavy, but JD didn't flinch. He just watched the guy, the smirk, the way he leaned back, arms crossed like he'd won something. JD had been in enough rooms, enough debates, to know when someone was just looking to poke the fire. But this wasn't just about politics. JD exhaled, slow and measured. Then he looked back at Don. "That how you feel too?" Don didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped against the back of the chair, his jaw tight. The whole diner was waiting, hanging on the moment. The man in the work jacket had finally set his fork down, and even the waitress behind the counter had stopped wiping down the coffee cups. The weight of the room had shifted. This wasn't just about one man sitting at a table anymore. Finally, Don shook his head just a little. "I don't know you," he admitted, voice lower now. "Not really. But I know this town. I know how folks around here feel." JD nodded. "And you think turning me away makes them feel better?" Don sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I think it keeps things from boiling over." JD leaned forward just slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Or it just keeps people from talking." That hit something. JD saw it in Don's face, the slight shift in his stance, the way his fingers curled a little tighter against the chair. Because deep down they both knew the easiest thing to do wasn't always the right thing. The diner was holding its breath now, waiting for something to snap. The younger guy in the booth scoffed again, but this time it felt forced, like he was trying to break the moment before it settled into something real. JD let the silence sit a little longer before he finally stood, slow and deliberate. He didn't slam his chair back, didn't huff or storm out. He just met Don's gaze one last time. "You don't have to serve me," JD said, voice even, steady. "But sooner or later, you're gonna have to decide if keeping the peace is worth keeping people quiet." Don said nothing, but the weight in his eyes said he heard it. JD gave a small nod, then turned toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped out, the cool night air wrapping around him. The smell of grilled burgers and fresh coffee still lingered, the low murmur of voices behind him starting up again. But the conversation inside? That wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He wasn't welcome, not because of what he'd done, but because of what people assumed about him. Yeah, that was different. JD met Don's gaze. "Not like this." Don leaned back, nodding slowly. "Figured." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "People around here don't trust easy. They've been burned too many times." JD didn't argue. He knew it was true. Hell, that was half the reason he was sitting here instead of walking out the door. The old man at the counter took another slow sip of coffee, then muttered, "Still don't mean you should turn a man away hungry." Dawn shot him a look, but there was no heat in it, just a kind of weary acknowledgement. JD glanced toward the younger guy in the booth, who still looked like he had something to say but hadn't quite figured out how to say it. "What about you?" JD asked, tone even. "Still think I should leave?" The guy shifted in his seat, arms uncrossing for the first time. He looked at JD, then at Dawn, then back again. Finally, he let out a short breath.
I don't know, man.
"I just don't trust politicians." JD nodded, taking another sip of the strong diner coffee. "Fair enough." And somehow, that seemed to settle something. Because the kid didn't argue, didn't sneer, just sat there, thinking. Mary the waitress came by again, slipping a menu in front of JD like it was no big deal. "Figure you might want to look at the specials," she said, then added with a smirk, "unless you're just here for the coffee." JD chuckled, flipping it open. "Well, I hear the burgers are good." Dawn let out something that might have been a laugh. "Yeah," he said. "They are." And just like that, the moment passed. The air in the diner shifted, not completely easy but no longer tense, no longer on the edge of something sharp. Conversation started back up, forks scraped against plates, and the kitchen went back to work. JD wasn't sure if he'd changed any minds tonight. But he knew one thing for sure. This conversation? It wasn't over. Not tonight. He wasn't welcome, not here, not in a place as simple as a diner. And not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented. JD let that settle for a moment. Then, finally, he admitted, "No, not like this." Dawn nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something he'd already been wondering. "And yet, you stayed." JD leaned back, took another sip of the strong diner coffee, and met Dawn's gaze.
Yeah.
Dawn let out a small chuckle. Most guys in your position? They'd have walked out. Made a scene. Maybe even called a lawyer. Maybe made sure this place was all over the news by morning. JD smirked. Thought about it. That actually got a laugh out of Dawn, short, but real. Then, just as quickly, his expression turned serious again. "Look, you're not gonna change everyone's mind." JD nodded. "I know." Dawn exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "And I can't promise I won't regret serving you tomorrow morning." JD grinned. "That's fair." From the counter, the old man with the work jacket spoke up again, not even bothering to lift his eyes from his coffee. "Still a damn shame when a man can't get a burger." JD glanced over, then back at Dawn. "Well, I think that's about to change." A moment later, Mary appeared, setting a plate down in front of him. A classic cheeseburger, hand-cut fries on the side. Simple. No frills. But exactly what a diner burger should be. JD picked it up, took a bite. Silence. Then, with a completely straight face, he said, "Little dry." For half a second, the whole diner froze. Then Dawn barked out a laugh, the first real one of the night. A few others chuckled. Even Mary shook her head, muttering something under her breath. JD set the burger down, wiping his hands on a napkin.
Kidding.
"It's good." Dawn shook his head, still smirking. "You're a piece of work." JD nodded. "I've been told." The younger guy in the booth didn't say anything, but something had shifted in his expression. He wasn't convinced, not completely. But he wasn't dismissing JD outright anymore either. As JD finished his meal, the diner started to feel like a diner again. Conversations picked up. Plates clattered. Coffee refills were poured. People still had their opinions, still had their doubts. But for one night in one small town, something different had happened. A conversation, not a confrontation. A moment of listening instead of shouting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Because in a time when everyone is ready to fight, sometimes the real power is in staying. In listening. In proving, if only for a moment, that not everything has to be a battle. If you've made it this far, I have a question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose, walk away or stay and listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if you found this one worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell. And I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.